Hello, good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I'm here in the studio in Cookadens on the south side of Glasgow, and I'm delighted as always to be joined by former MSP Maureen Watt. Maureen, great to have you with us.
Good evening and thank you very much for having me, Donald.
Delighted indeed. And tonight we've got a lot to get through in a packed programme, including profits for business, losses for ordinary people, ambition for Scottish children, and a loss of ambition for some university students in England. Small business squeezes, Hollywood freezes, fuel insecurity, and ferry travel access. But before we get to all that, we start as always with what is now day 433 in our Ukrainian update, the 433rd day that Ukraine has been attacked by Russia in their illegal war. And today, US intelligence estimates that Russia's military has suffered 100,000 casualties, including more than 20,000 dead in the past 5 months alone in fighting against the Ukraine, mostly in the Bakhmut region, according to White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby. The Kremlin rejected the assessment as having been plucked from thin air and said that Washington had no way of obtaining the correct data. Russia last publicly revealed its tally of losses in the campaign in September when the Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu said 5,937 Russian soldiers had been killed in the conflict. Ukraine's military has vowed not to give up the eastern city of Bakhmut as it prepares to launch a counter-offensive against Russian forces. General Alexander Syrsky, commander of Ukrainian ground forces, underlined the importance Kyiv attaches to holding Bakhmut as preparations continue for a counter-attack which it hopes will change the dynamic of the war in Ukraine. All parties in the Black Sea Grain Initiative will meet for talks on Wednesday, according to a senior Ukrainian source. Susplain, the Ukraine state broadcaster, reports that overnight 3 apartment buildings and a school were damaged in Kramatorsk after a strike by Russian S-300 missiles, which caused 1 injury. And the governor of Kharkiv, Oleh Syniehubov, has reported that a woman has been injured in the shelling of the village of Petropavlivka, which is close to Ukraine's border with Russia. Ukrainian forces shelled a village in the Russian Bryansk region bordering Ukraine early on Tuesday, the local government said in a social media post, a day after an explosion derailed a freight train in the region. And elsewhere in Europe, Denmark's acting defence minister, Troels Lund Poulsen, has said the country will donate 1.7 billion Danish crowns to Ukraine for military purposes. On Monday, Russia unleashed a fresh missile attack on Ukraine in the east, killing 2 people, setting off huge blazes and damaging dozens of homes and other buildings in the city of Pavlohrad. Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, the commander of Ukrainian ground forces, has said counterattacks have ousted Russian forces from some positions in the besieged eastern city of Bakhmut, but the situation remains quite difficult. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private militia, renewed his appeal to Russia's defence ministry to increase ammunition shipments to his fighters trying to seize Bakhmut. In a video which was posted on his Telegram channel, Prigozhin said that he needs at least 300 tons of artillery shells a day for the assault. And in Washington, Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy emphatically stressed his support for military aid to Ukraine on Monday, criticising Russia's killing of the children and distancing himself from some in his party who oppose additional major US aid to repel the Russian invasion. Maureen, the one thing that catches my eye there is the last bit. I see that the cat's away going to play golf, unfortunately, in my part of the world down near Turnberry and your part of the world up near Aberdeen. Do you think that the mice like Kevin McCarthy have now got a wee opportunity to say what they really think without actually being condemned?
Well, that's assuming that that Trump is not watching what's happening back home, and he's on the golf course too much. I'm not sure that he'd be able to turn his mind off from American politics that much. But it's good to see that both Democrats and Republicans are united in backing Ukraine and still realizing that there is a fight that is worth fighting, not just for Ukraine, but for us all. But, it just does look that with all the shelling that Russia just wants to obliterate Ukraine off the map, really, doesn't it? So I don't think this counteroffensive from Ukraine can come soon enough. And I just hope that all the armaments and equipment that they have been promised by the West arrive in time so that they can get ahead with that and shove back the Russians to the Russian borders and out of all of Ukraine, including Crimea.
Indeed, and we go from international news in America to international news from here that affects quite a few parts of the world, as the United Kingdom government has announced that it will acquire a fleet of ships to house asylum seekers. The Guardian today reported that the UK Home Office is planning to use 10 redundant cruise ships, ferries and barges to house asylum seekers in ports around the country, with Merseyside expected to be next in line as ministers struggle to get to grips with the asylum backlog. Officials have been told to look at all options to find housing for people caught up in processing delays, including former military camps and prisons, with a total backlog more than 1,500 higher than in December, when Prime Minister Rishi Sunak pledged to clear it within a year. The revelation that the government wants as many as 10 vessels at a cost of millions of pounds to the taxpayer comes after ministers confirmed plans to house about 400 people in a giant barge in Dorset, as they try to allay concerns from Tory backbenchers over the use of hotels in their constituencies. It is being reported that Home Secretary Suella Braverman was close to confirming a deal for an 1,800 capacity former cruise ship to house migrants that would be berthed in the Mersey, although no contract has yet been signed. Peel Ports, which owns and operates port infrastructure in the Birkenhead area, has said it would only go ahead with the plans if there was full engagement with the local council. Local politicians, however, have condemned the proposal, pointing to a lack of infrastructure and describing the plans as a floating prison. The UK government is reported to be plotting to force Sunak's illegal migration bill into law if it is blocked or watered down by the House of Lords this summer, with plans to use the Parliament Act to overrule peers to force the legislation onto the statute book. Plans for additional accommodation include former military bases at Wethersfield and Scampton, which would hold 3,700 people, and also the reopening of immigration detention centres, Haslar in Hampshire and Campsfield near Oxford, which would hold 1,000. A further 1,200 people could be accommodated at North Eye, a former prison in East Sussex, and at Barracks in Catterick in Sunak's North Yorkshire constituency, while 400 people would be placed on the barge in Portland in Dorset. Maureen, do you think there's a possibility that, given the government's relationship with contracts, there's a possibility that some wit has proven to the Home Secretary that one of these vessels could actually make it all the way to Rwanda, the landlocked country in the centre of Africa that she dreams of sending people to? This is surely something that has taken us from goodness knows where into the ridiculous.
So we're going to stop the small boats coming across, but we're going to hire lots of big boats and take them to Africa. Aye, right. It's just such a mess, and it would be laughable if it wasn't so awful in terms of people's lives. These are people that we're talking about who are asylum seekers, that is, fleeing from their countries that are at war, and obviously now Sudan has joined that list, and people who really need our shelter and our help, and all this talk of requiring all this accommodation, whether it be on boats or cruise ships or old prisons or old army bases or whatever, just as you said, Donald, shows that they are not at all being able to process the claims of the asylum seekers at all quickly and get the lists of asylum seekers down. In fact, as you said, they are increasing. I mean, I heard I read today, and I was out in Elgin, although I didn't go that far, that apparently the Eight Acres Hotel on the Nairn side of Elgin is going to house asylum seekers. So they are obviously looking to get accommodation wherever they can. And as you say, without consulting the local authorities, without giving them prior warning, that they will have to find places in schools, they'll have to find interpreters. The pressure on their social work departments and education departments is going to be huge without, I suspect, any additional resources in that field. So a complete and utter mess of hiding asylum seekers away in prisons, in old prisons and in old army bases when the country is crying out for workers. A complete and utter shambles from this Westminster government.
Indeed, and you hit upon something that's very, I think, hidden within the statistics, is that we are sitting here with a shortage of workers in certain parts of our economy, and we are trying to repel at our borders people fleeing from conflict, much of which we have been partly, if not in some cases, wholly responsible for beginning. This is surely a failure of immigration policy, not just now, but for several years in the past.
Absolutely, since this Tory government came to power. But, you know, it's using asylum seekers, and people have fled conflict, since time immemorial. It's not something new. People shift as their lands become desertified, or as you say, mostly it's because of conflict. And that's been happening, or economic necessity, and that's been happening for centuries. But the way that this government is using asylum seekers to appeal to their own base is appalling, absolutely appalling. And that's why the status of the UK and the Westminster government is falling inexorably on the world stage. People just don't understand how a country who can be so cruel and is not accepting anything like a huge number of other countries around the world. I mean, we just have to look across to EU countries surrounding the Mediterranean and the countries between the Mediterranean and the UK and see how many asylum seekers they have taken. Nothing much more, sorry, I should say, than the UK is ever likely to have to deal with. So it is being used as a political end.
Did we go from the politics of economics to economics leading to political questions, as BP has announced profits of £4 billion for the first 3 months of 2023. Huge profits at BP have sparked renewed calls for a tougher windfall tax after the oil and gas giant recorded one of its best ever starts to the year, while Britons up and down the UK struggle to pay high energy bills. The energy company said its underlying profits reached $5 billion in the first 3 months of this year, outstripping analyst forecasts, which were set at $4.3 billion. It represents the second best results for the first quarter it has notched up since 2012, when it made $4.7 billion behind last year's $6.2 billion. BP said its results had been boosted by reduced refining costs, an exceptional result in its gas trading arm, and a very strong oil trading result. Volatility in the energy markets has increased revenues in the trading divisions of oil companies. The company said it would reward investors buying back $1.7 billion of its own shares, a slowdown on the $2.7 billion bought during the previous quarter. BP shares fell by 5% this morning. The results will return attention to the debate over whether oil and gas firms should face a harsher windfall tax on their profits. SNP economy spokesperson Stewart MP said, with energy companies reporting bumper profits, the Tories must hand North Sea oil and gas profits back to Scotland instead of hoarding them at Westminster. Scotland is an energy-rich country, and it's utterly shameful that under the Tories, he continued, millions of Scottish families are being forced to pay through the nose for energy bills, while the Westminster Treasury reaps the benefits of Scotland's energy wealth. The money raised through the windfall tax on oil and gas companies must be reinvested in Scotland. The UK government must use it to bring down energy bills in Scotland and finally match the Scottish government's £500 million Just Transition Fund. Maureen, I don't understand this. When you go and you buy something, somebody has bought that at a cost and sells you at a profit. I get that. When somebody else sets the price of that, I can understand that too. But then when there's an intervention in order to subsidise the market and to pay money, and I would have thought that BP, Shell and all these energy companies were struggling because we're not paying as much as we should be paying because the government's intervening, but they're making more profits and people are struggling. It all seems an economic muddle.
Well, it's certainly an economic muddle. And the cost of energy and the price we pay at the pump compared to how much it costs to get out of the ground. I remember knowing what the two were. I'm not sure what the latest sums are. I know that oil companies since the crash, the last oil crash, have been trying to minimise their costs. But obviously, with the crisis in energy because of Ukraine, we've seen the prices rise, and the only people who seem to be benefiting are the oil major companies and the shareholders, because they said that they might give an increase to the shareholders, but nothing about increase to their workers. And more importantly, in the North Sea, certainly at the moment, where we have contractor companies striking, is to pass down their increase in income to the contracting companies who are paying most of the workers in the offshore oil industry. These major companies have very few workers themselves on the oil rigs. So it would be nice to see if the contracting companies got some more of this money that they are making to pass on to their workers. But this is BP today, it's Shell, I think, next week. And I think that the government has to revisit whether its tax on energy companies, the windfall taxes, are actually working. It would be interesting to see how much money they've taken in. And as you said, quoting Stewart, we've still got to see the UK government's share of the Just Transition Fund being distributed to Scotland and to help energy companies transition to renewables. The Scottish government is paying up, but we've still got to see the Westminster money. Absolutely awful.
And it's not therefore just the consumer that's not seeing the benefit of these reaping huge profits, but workers and contractual workers and those who are not actually employed by BP but are doing work on behalf of BP, that yet another attempt to squeeze down costs, which therefore leads to higher profits, lower wages, and it seems like particularly in the northeast, where this transition from fossil fuels into greener energy is something that they are liking the headlines when they get the opportunity to say how wonderful they are, but not liking the detail where they could actually make a difference if they made an effort.
Yeah, I think that's what's called greenwashing, isn't it, Donald? It is difficult to know just how far the oil producers have got in terms of greening their energy production. I suppose because it's offshore, it's not something that can be easily tracked by outsiders, and it's difficult to measure, I suppose. You know, it is really important that there is a just transition, not just in the northeast, but it is mainly in the northeast, and it's the northeast that has the expertise to make that transition. But it does need help, and more than help, actually direction from the UK government, who is still unfortunately in charge of energy. I mean, I've talked on these programs before about how many energy ministers we've had in the 15 years that I was an elected politician. It runs into the tens, 20s at least. Nobody gets time to get a handle on the energy portfolio before they're changed out again. So they want the money and they want the income from the North Sea, but they don't give it the attention that it really requires. And it's really important at this stage when we need a just transition to green energy. Otherwise, we're going to see the same devastation that we saw under Margaret Thatcher and other industries.
And in terms of economics, going from something that I may not completely understand to something I really do understand, it was announced today that food price inflation has jumped to 15.7%. The UK's biggest supermarkets are facing calls for the UK's competition watchdog to investigate claims of profiteering amid the cost of living crisis, as industry figures show food price inflation soared to a record high in April. Government figures show food and drink prices rose by almost 20% in the year to March, the fastest annual rate since 1977. Analysis shows that the cost of a typical weekly shop has now risen by nearly £12, or £604 in the space of a year. Last week, Sainsbury's announced profits of £690 million for the year to the 4th of March, beating expectations. Tesco recorded profits of £753 million last year, half the level a year earlier. Ken Murphy, the Tesco chief executive, said the retailer was robustly challenging every cost increase with suppliers and had not passed on all its additional costs to shoppers. The call for an investigation comes as figures from the British Retail Consortium show food price inflation soared to the highest level on industry records in April. The latest snapshot from the retail industry body showed food price inflation accelerated to 15.7%, up from just 15% in March. Commenting, the SNP's David Linden MP said households across the UK continue to suffer from the ongoing Tory-made cost of living crisis. As a result of Westminster rule, Scotland has been forced to watch on as the Tories crashed the economy, allowed energy bills to skyrocket and imposed a hard Brexit on us against our will. And with a pro-Brexit Labour Party cheering them on every step of the way, there are no clear signs of a revival. However, for Scotland, there is an alternative. By taking control of our own affairs, we could mitigate the damage imposed on us by Westminster and finally forge our own path. Maureen, isn't it interesting that this is profiteering at the expense of the cost of living crisis? BP and Shell, not necessarily the headlines, profiteering on the back of the cost of living crisis and the shortage of products such as gas and so on. It seems to be that the two are catching the media in different ways, but what is clear is that when you go to the petrol station, when you switch on your oven, and when you go to fill it with food, every single person in the UK is feeling the effect, unless you're a shareholder for one of the companies.
Absolutely. And there's no doubt that post COVID, um, where neither the energy companies nor the supermarkets really felt the pinch because everybody still needed food and energy, that they, among other companies, are trying to, well, in those two instances, stuff their coffers full, and other companies trying to refill their coffers, all at the expense of the consumer, and the customer. So it's the ordinary person in the street that is really suffering at the moment. And I was out knocking doors on Saturday, and that's what people wanted to talk about, is how Westminster has crashed the economy. And, more people than I thought were saying that independence is the answer. And that's why, to go on to another subject, even although the SNP has its own internal problems at the moment, people still see that independence is a way out of this, and that controlling our own economy and making our own decisions can make a difference. It doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be austerity for the poorest while the rich get richer. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, with all these huge profits for the energy companies and the supermarkets, and inflation still running high. And I heard one commentator say that as fruit and vegetables come on stream from the UK, we might see a dip, but then you see huge temperatures early on now, in other countries where we would expect to get food from, like Spain and Portugal. So I don't think we're going to see a huge fall in inflation anytime soon, given what's happening at the moment. I don't think the runes look good on this. And that was one of the things, of course, that Rishi Sunak said that he would try and bring down. We shall see.
And I suppose that, and I remember Baroness Worsey on a particular programme on TV talking about how, we meaning the Conservatives, we used to be trusted in terms of the economy. And that would be their clarion cry, that, everybody was profligate, but they were the people who looked after the coffers, and they could work out. I think it was Thatcher who coined the idea of, a domestic budget being how a housewife would be able to understand. I know we're a long way away from both of those concepts, i.e. Mrs. Thatcher and also a housewife. But isn't it interesting that when you go round in constituencies, what you're finding ordinary people talking about is not what the Holyrood or the Westminster bubble want to talk about, but what they want to actually discover is what politicians are going to do for the very big issues in a household, which are not talking points, but matters of survival.
Yeah, absolutely. And, more and more people are relying on food banks simply because everything else is going up, and, they know that they can probably get food from food banks. But even food banks are struggling because supermarket shelves have, we all know, been more empty because of Brexit. And they haven't got the surplus food that they would have had prior to Brexit to pass on to food banks. So it's a real crisis for ordinary folk. And we've seen the French take to the streets, and well, I think pensioners did today, didn't they, about pensions?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's going to come that we're going to see more people taking to the streets, because what else can you do with a Tory government that's such a huge majority, and people see that they're only feeding their own coffers and those of their pals at the expense of ordinary folk? And
Indeed.
Labour doesn't seem, Labour's just a pale imitation of the Tories. It's trying to move so far to the right, thinking that it's going to capture votes from the Tories, and it's just a mess, absolute mess.
Well, one of the ways in which the SNP government are attempting to help and meet the needs of those not just within its own boundaries but elsewhere is challenging the UK government to match the ambition that they've laid out of the Scottish Child Payment. The SNP challenged the UK government to match the ambition UK-wide of the Scottish Child Payment by raising the child element of universal credit by £25 a week. With Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf convening a cross-party anti-poverty summit in Edinburgh on Wednesday, Stephen Flynn MP warned Westminster policies are making people poorer and undermining progress in tackling poverty in Scotland. The SNP Westminster leader challenged Rishi Sunak to introduce a comprehensive package of measures to reverse child poverty across the whole of the United Kingdom, including raising the child element of universal credit by £25 a week UK-wide, scrapping the benefit cap, introducing a real living wage, setting statutory targets to eliminate child poverty. The latest OECD figures show that the UK has the worst levels of poverty of any country in northwest Europe, with a higher poverty rate than all of the UK's European neighbours, including Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Germany, Switzerland and Austria. Despite the UK government scrapping targets to eradicate child poverty in the UK in 2015, the Scottish government has introduced statutory targets for Scotland. In 2022 and 2023, the Scottish Government has allocated almost £3 billion to support policies tackling poverty. This includes introducing 5 Scottish Government payments to support families, including the £25 a week Scottish Child Payment and the Best Start grant. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP said, "Tackling poverty is a defining mission of the SNP government, but for every step Scotland takes forward to eradicate poverty, Westminster is taking us back again." While progressive SNP policies like the Scottish Child Payment are putting money into people's pockets and reducing inequality, damaging Westminster policies are making people poorer and undermining progress on tackling poverty in Scotland. Well, there exactly is one of the means in which the Scottish Government, one of 5 different means the Scottish Government have attempted to do in order to alleviate the crisis, the poverty. And you talked about food banks, and yes, the Trussell Trust and many others are talking about the demands of working people upon their resources. This seems like a simple thing for the UK government to do, but you've got the funny feeling that they're not going to.
Yeah, whether it's because the opposition proposed it or whatever, but what an indictment, Donald, on the UK and the Westminster government. That poverty in the UK is at the highest rate of any of the countries that you mentioned. You know, Ireland, the UK government used to look down on. The GDP in Ireland is much higher now than for those in the UK. It is absolutely shocking. And if there's still people who don't think that this Westminster government is taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich, I don't know what planet they're living on. But if Rishi Sunak was to introduce the child payment, then perhaps some of the Tories in the government have a slight conscience about what they're doing. But I doubt that's going to happen. And certainly, devolved government in Scotland was not set up to have to mitigate the worst effects of this awful Tory government in Westminster. But that's what's happening with billions, as you said, of money which should be going to other things rather than having to eliminate a poverty that is being caused by the Westminster government. But we have to do it. There's no other option, or people and children would be starving and on the streets. And I'm really proud of the child payment that the Scottish Government introduced and is now at £25, and the Best Start grant and the baby box. But yet we have these cruel payments, cruel policies of Westminster government, like the 2-child cap and things like that, which are just, if it was any other country, this country would be calling them out. But that's not what's happening now. And it's shocking and shameful that the UK has the highest poverty rate and that the UK government is doing nothing about it.
And we go from one call in one Westminster political party to the other Westminster political party, with news today that whilst we see the SNP calling the Conservative Party to have ambition, it would appear that the Labour Party has decided to roll back on ambition, as they are going to roll back on their promise to abolish university tuition fees in England. Keir Starmer has said Labour is planning to drop its long-standing commitment, arguing it was necessary to move on from the idea because of the economic situation. Starmer said his party was looking at options for how to fund universities, but made it clear the existing promise to get rid of student-paid tuition fees, one of the pledges he made when standing to lead Labour in 2020, was being dropped. He said, "We are likely to move on from that commitment because we do find ourselves in a different financial situation," he told BBC Radio 4's Today programme. The announcement prompted criticism from Labour students, whose Vice-Chair Fabiha Askari said ditching the policy would be seen by young people as a massive betrayal of our futures and risks alienating Labour from our party's own core vote. Momentum, the left-leaning Labour group, said Starmer risked a Nick Clegg moment, a reference to the decision by the former Liberal Democrat leader during the coalition with the Conservatives to change policy and embrace student fees. It is the latest among a series of the 10 pledges Starmer made to Labour members when he was standing to replace Jeremy Corbyn that he has since either dropped altogether or somewhat fudged. Other pledges that have been subsequently rolled back from or watered down include one to ensure public services should be in public hands, to defend the free movement of people from the EU, and to stand shoulder to shoulder with trade unions, though obviously not in a picket line. The SNP's education spokesperson Carol Monaghan MP said, "No one can trust a word Keir Starmer says. He flip-flops from one commitment to another, whichever way the wind takes him. It's utterly embarrassing. The Labour Party is looking more and more like a Tory tribute band as Keir Starmer lurches even further to the right by ditching another one of his key election pledges." Well, Maureen, we know that Jeremy has been Corbynned by the Labour Party, and he's not going to be allowed to stand on behalf of them in the next election. Is there a socialist policy left on the shelf in Labour Party headquarters that they can roll out at an election?
Well, if there is one, I haven't heard it from the current leadership of the Labour Party at Westminster, and it's certainly not something that I've heard the Labour Party in Scotland promoting. But you're absolutely right. I think, we talked already this evening about how Keir Starmer is moving further and further to the right, presumably in order to attract Labour votes. And he's not looking at the polls because it's not working, is it? Because the Tories, the gap or the lead that the Labour Party have or had is narrowing. So that's clearly not what people want to hear. And, in a way, you feel sorry for the people in England who want something different because they simply haven't got a party that is offering them a clear alternative to what's happening now, as I say, because there are blue Tories and red Tories, and Liberal Democrats. It's interesting you mentioned how they got their fingers burnt with ditching the abolition of tuition fees to go into coalition with the Tories in 2010, was it? Yeah, I think it was. So yes, tuition fees are abhorrent to Scots who believe in the, education for those who have the ability to learn, not the ability to pay. And we do have a problem with funding universities, as we do with lots of other things. But I think somebody said once that the rocks would melt in the sun. And while I don't agree with that person on many things at the moment, that is one thing that he did get right.
Indeed, and it's fascinating, isn't it? It's almost like a cultural difference between two different countries. One looking at the ability to pay, and the other one looking at the ability to learn. And I think there's probably a whole load of different examples that we could use that shows that the border is not just a physical difference between two countries, but there is an emotional connection that both have differently placed. And certainly for us, the idea of tuition fees coming back would ensure that a political party was sitting in the doldrums and indeed out in the frosty north for many, many decades thereafter. But one wonders if the Scottish Labour Party can sell it up here.
Yeah, I mean, I can't see how they can. It's about giving people dignity. And if you're downtrodden and burdened with a huge amount of debt, and you've got this debt hanging about you, are you going to be your most productive at work? Are you going to be somebody who has got the ambition to get on the housing ladder and help, their families and be able to kind of live a decent life? And, it's the whole idea of, you get an education, you thereby have the chance to earn more, and you pay it back through your taxes. And I think that is still a good way of running a country, rather than, as I say, having so many people in debt and feeling that they can't reach their full potential. That was a slogan once, wasn't it? Still stands.
And we go to the best way for running a country to the best way to running a business. As today it was announced that the cost of living squeeze is holding back UK small businesses. As small businesses across the United Kingdom are warning that the cost of living squeeze is holding back growth, economic growth, after 2 in 5 company bosses reported a drop in sales at the start of the year. The Federation of Small Businesses said that although business confidence was rising before the summer, soaring costs and weakness in consumer demand were still weighing on activity. According to the latest snapshot from its Small Business Index, a record 92% of companies said costs were higher in the first quarter compared with the same period last year. After a challenging start to the year, 2 in 5 small firms expected their sales to increase in the next quarter. The Federation of Small Businesses said that business confidence was being restored after plummeting at the end of last year, but warned there were still dark clouds in the horizon. Further interest rate increases from the Bank of England could dampen the recovery of small business, while firms are also under pressure from the high costs of energy, raw materials and transport, and rising staff wage bills. Economists widely expect the bank to increase rates from the current level of 4.25% in response to inflation, sticking above 10% in March, more than 5 times the central bank's 2% target rate. The Federation of Small Businesses, which represents more than 150,000 businesses and self-employed workers, surveyed nearly 700 people. The reading on its Small Business Index rose to 2.8 in the first quarter, up 43 points from the final 3 months of 2022, but still about 18 points below the same period a year ago. When we talk about the business sector, I think we do tend to have a little bit of a prejudice, those of us who might not be self-employed. I am. And I can certainly say without a shadow of a doubt that small businesses are where spending money pays dividends. And if they're feeling it, then the recovery that we should be seeing is still a heck of a far way off.
Yes, it is, definitely. You know, when you do venture out, you're always thinking, it's going to cost me more when you get into a shop. And when people are maybe taking a trip out on a Saturday or a Sunday, they're very mindful now of how much it's going to be if you're going into the tea room or the gift shop or whatever, the garden centre, when you go out. So you can quite see where the Federation of Small Business is coming from. And, things were a bit better. And I think that is probably a bounce after COVID where people weren't going out and perhaps saved a bit of money, but it's now being eaten up by the increase in food prices and energy prices that we're talking about. So I still think it's very fragile, but that's why, it is important to encourage people to buy locally and to support local small businesses when they can, because they're the ones that will keep a high street open and vibrant, rather than the big companies which are very quick at wanting to shut down their stores on the high street. And it's the small businesses, as I say, who've perhaps been there long standing that need our support to keep going at the moment, because as you said, they face the higher energy bills and things like other people do. So yeah, I think this is a very fragile point for a lot of small businesses, and hopefully as the weather gets better and people do venture out more, they think about shopping local rather than in the major supermarkets and places.
Well, and across the water over in Hollywood, if we were looking for anybody to make film or television out of whatever is happening across here just now, they're in for a little bit of a shock because Hollywood film and TV writers have gone on strike. Hollywood productions have ground to a halt as thousands of film and television writers went on strike after last-minute talks with major studios over wages broke down. The Writers Guild of America, the WGA, called its first stoppage in 15 years after failing to reach an agreement on higher pay, pitting its 11,500 screenwriters against old guard companies such as Universal, Paramount and Walt Disney, as well as tech newcomers such as Netflix, Amazon and Apple. Now, the last strike was in 2007. It lasted for 100 days, cost the Californian economy an estimated $2.1 billion as production shut down and out-of-work writers, actors and producers cut back on their spending. The WGA said the company's behaviour had created a gig economy that aimed to turn writing into an entirely freelance profession. For the sake of our present and our future, we have been given no other choice, it said. In an interview with Deadline, the president of WGA West, Meredith Stein, said writers were facing an existential threat. We've been here for 6 weeks talking to them, and those core proposals were literally ignored. The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP, which represents the studios, said late on Monday that it had offered generous increases in compensation to writers, but that the two sides had been unable to reach a deal because of other proposals, such as a requirement that company staff shows with a certain number of writers for a specified period of time, whether needed or not. Writers say they have suffered financially during the TV streaming boom, partly because of shorter seasons and similar residual payments. According to WGA statistics, half of TV series writers now work at minimum salary levels, compared with 1/3 in 2013-14. Median pay at the higher writer-producer level has fallen 4% over the last decade. For viewers, the most immediate effects of the strike will be felt on late-night talk and sketch shows. Shows such as Saturday Night Live, The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel Live, and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, which use teams of writers to come up with their topical jokes, are expected to immediately stop production. Further ahead, the strike could lead to a delay of the autumn TV season, for which writing normally starts in May or June. Media companies are facing a tough economic backdrop under pressure from investors to make their streaming services profitable after investing billions of dollars in programs to attract subscribers. Last year, Netflix's market value tumbled by almost $45 billion after it predicted a drop in new subscribers. Meanwhile, the rise of streaming has led to declining television ad revenue as traditional TV audiences shrink and advertisers go elsewhere. The WGA also wants safeguards to prevent studios from using AI to generate new scripts from writers' previous work, and writers want to ensure they are not asked to rewrite draft scripts created by artificial intelligence. Maureen, this is something I know a little bit about. Not that I've ever been a Hollywood TV or film writer, but what I really do know about is the effect of something having a ripple. We've seen it with factories closing down, shipyards closing down, major industries coming to a halt. And here within that part of America, the fact that productions are going to halt is going to really make those who are contributing to it in a small way having an even higher effect on them, because they're not going to have people coming to buy products and services from them. So all things seem to be compatible, although, of course, during lockdown, where would we have been without Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Sky, all of the things, all of the shows that we could access in order to get us through the day?
Yes, but when people go through their bank statements and see what they're paying on a monthly basis, they are asking whether they need all these subscriptions to these channels. So I'm glad you talked about it at length, Donald, because I'm not sure that I have got much to add. But I maybe ask you, if the writers are on strike in the US, does that create an opportunity for writers and producers elsewhere to make more films? Because we have been increasing the capacity in Scotland, for example, for people to produce films and TV series. So could it have a benefit in the long term to the industry here or not? I'm not quite sure.
Not immediately, because the gestation period of television being the most obvious one to pick up on, because that will have an effect more than a film. Film producers will eventually just fund films all over the place, but for television there's the pools of writers, and what you will find, an American television series will run from 22 episodes. A British television series traditionally would be 6 to 10 episodes. American television would be a room of writers. British television would be a single or 2 or 3 writers. So the way in which they're balanced is different. But what the BBC has done is it has cut the budget for BBC drama, and particularly for radio drama, which is an appalling thing to happen, because through BBC radio drama, so much has then become transferable into television production, and things like the comedy unit in the BBC as well. STV or the ITV don't have the same kind of connection to radio that the BBC has. But what we've seen is that while Scotland has begun to invest increasingly in the, and we've got blockbusters, I mean, not just Black Girl having been cancelled, but all Indiana Jones, let's all go and look at Glasgow in its finery and its glory, being 1960s downtown. I can't remember where it's, Chicago or New York or wherever. But, we've got lots of examples of how Scotland has been chased after for productions, and certainly the opportunity to develop more television product, I think, should be grasped whilst this disadvantageous thing is going on in America. But it'll take 3 or 4 months before we see it, and it would need a change of investment. And one of the people who would lead that in a UK sense would the BBC. But I think we in Scotland ain't daft. We've been through the Rob Roy, we've been through the Braveheart, I know because I was there. And not much came out after it. But what seems to have really cottoned on in Scotland now is an understanding that it might not just be the blockbusters we're looking for, but those other, Waterloo Road, I think, came up the road, if you pardon the pun, at one point, so that moving these productions around can also be a great benefit. So the answer to your question is possibly, but not for some time, but there are worrying signs within the industry in the UK, because the profits and that many of these streaming services took wasn't invested back into the industry, and particularly in the production of new talent, of new people. And of course, in my house, if anybody is listening, the answer to do you need all those services is always yes, I do. So we go from there to the insecurity of the Fuel Insecurity Fund, and the Scottish Government has tackled this by increasing it. Announced a major expansion of this year's Fuel Insecurity Fund with the aim of delivering even more tailored support to tens of thousands of households. The First Minister announced in March that the fund will be tripled to £30 million this year. Details have now been announced of how the additional funding will be used to help those who need it most through new and existing services. This will include £5 million for one-to-one mentoring for households to be provided by a new funding partner, the WISE Group, as part of a longer-term approach to tackling poverty and its causes. Households will also be helped through additional funding being directed to existing delivery partners, including £9 million to enable Advice Direct Scotland to administer Home Heating Support Fund grants to those struggling with a rapid increase in gas, electricity and oil prices. £8.5 million for the Fuel Bank Foundation to rapidly support more than 85,000 households, including those with prepayment meters and at risk of imminent disconnection. £7.25 million to enable the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations to provide more than 55,000 households across Scotland with advice, support with bills and energy-saving items. Details of the additional support were announced ahead of an anti-poverty summit, which is being convened by the First Minister tomorrow. Those with direct experience of poverty, as well as experts from the public, private and third sectors, will take part. Energy Minister Gillian Martin visited Advice Direct Scotland's Glasgow headquarters to meet advisors and learn more about how they are supporting people who are struggling to heat their homes. The Minister said the Fuel Insecurity Fund has been and continues to be a direct lifeline for many thousands of households, which is why the First Minister acted swiftly and decisively to triple the fund to £30 million this year. We want to support even more people facing unprecedented rises in the cost of energy. Whilst the key energy policy levers remain with the UK Government, one of our interdependent missions as a government is to tackle poverty and protect people from the impact of the current cost of living crisis. The UK Government has continually failed to take the necessary steps to support people now and make the necessary changes to ensure households and businesses never experience an energy crisis like this again. Once again, Maureen, Scottish Government trying to do the right thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, once again stepping in, and as the payments from the UK Government end, it's good that the Scottish Government is stepping in and targeted this time, which is the best policy.
And targeted also, finally tonight, is Scottish Government announcements that plans are being made to make ferry travel more accessible. A fund to improve accessibility in Scotland's ferry networks has been opened for an 8th round of applications. The Ferries Accessibility Fund helps support organisations to make improvements to their vessels, to their harbours, that go beyond regulatory standards set for accessibility. Awards are being made on a match funding basis with up to £71,143 available for bids from the public or private sector. Minister for Transport, Kevin Stewart, said, "I'm delighted to open the Ferries Accessibility Fund for an 8th round of applications, as it's proved a hugely successful initiative in recent years. The fund has brought tangible improvements across our ferry networks in a wide variety of forms. Previous projects range from the installation of changing places, facilities and board vessels, and the funding of specialist equipment, to giving staff training to help with autistic passengers. We want ferry and harbour operators to provide the best passenger experience possible, so I encourage any potential bidders to come forward with proposals to improve their services. It's an interesting thing, that, in terms of accessibility and looking at just how accessibility means for those who find accessibility difficult.
Yeah, I can't speak for the Calmac ferries, but I know the Northlink, I'm not sure if it's all or one of the Northlink ferries going to Orkney and Shetland has installed a changing places toilet, which will make a huge difference for passengers wanting to travel with disabled family members or other relatives. So it's that kind of thing that can make a huge difference to people's ability to travel if they have a disability. And as you say, if there's a place with, balls or lights for people with autism, where they can maybe just go for a few minutes to calm themselves. These things can make a huge difference to making family travel even possible where it wasn't before. So, yeah, good to see this fund.
Indeed. And as I said, Maureen, that's us got to the end of our evening. And can I thank you very much for your contribution tonight? As always, absolutely fantastic to have you.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
And it is indeed, that is all for this evening. But before I go, I just as usual want to remind you of something. Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated, and to every single one of you who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment on behalf of us all here and all who support us, thank you very much. We have made our commitment that all our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter so that we can continue to provide you with this type of coverage that looks at the media, the news, things happening around and above us and amongst us in a uniquely Scottish manner. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here tonight, and the night that I discovered, according to the UK government, in a 21st century Orwellian style vision, that big boats are good, wee boats are bad. It's good night, and thank you for watching.